Hi, this is Paul, and I have a very special guest today that I asked to have a conversation with. Often people reach out to me, but I reached out to James after I saw his conversation with Jordan Peterson on the hoax papers that he did. So, James, you probably don't need a lot of introduction, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I have a background in physics and mathematics. I did a bachelor's degree in physics and master's and PhD in math that was concluded in 2010, and I stepped away from academia for various commitments I had in my personal life. More than I wish I could say I was prescient and saw the writing on the wall, but no, I just had other obligations in my life come up, and responsibility is as responsibility does. So I left academia, and to keep from getting academically bored, I started studying mostly kind of philosophy of science and philosophy of religion early on. And then I got into, that led me into studying psychology, particularly of religion and moral psychology, and trying to figure out, as you wanted to invite me on to talk about, how I kind of took this winding path. I talked to Dr. Peterson about it, about how I meandered my way into trying to answer the question when religious people, because I'm surrounded by them, I live in the southeastern US, when they talk to me about God, I firmly believe that they're talking about something. I don't think that they're crazy like a lot of atheist types do. I just wanted to try to understand it without the religious side of it. And so I started digging into the religious psychology, particularly, and moral psychology, to try to understand where they're coming from, to be able to build bridges, reach across, hear people, and they can say it in their words, and I can hear it in terms of what I think I understand. And we can still have great conversations and things. And so that, through whatever varying reasons, led me to get involved in culture war type conversations online a lot. That led me to see lots of stuff happening with people getting accused of racism and sexism where it just didn't seem to fit. Started to see weird sociological definitions applied, and that's how they were getting accused. So I got really curious, along with my collaborators, Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose, and even Mike Nana, our filmmaker, kind of collaborated with us. He didn't write any papers with us, but he did help with ideas and putting together and understanding what we were facing. And so he's really, more involved than we've let on. But at any rate, we started looking into the scholarship that's coming out of what we called grievance studies, which would be like gender studies, race studies, even some sociology, post-colonial studies, queer studies, fat studies, something studies. And so we started looking at this pretty closely, how they try to produce and legitimize their claims to knowledge, what their ethics are, how this came to be. And then ultimately we wanted to verify that we knew what we were doing by reproducing it in rather hysterical, exaggerated ways, slightly satirical ways, by sending in these intentionally broken academic papers to their peer-reviewed journals, not predatory journals, not low-bar journals, but significant journals within the niche disciplines, and see if they would accept and or publish them, and see what their peer reviewers would say about these intentionally flawed papers. So over the course of 10 months, we wrote 20 papers, and over the course of about almost 15 months, we dealt with the submitting, the revising, the resubmitting, and so on, and ended up with 7 of our papers getting accepted. 4 of those actually were published, with one getting accolades from its journal. We had 7 more that we thought we could still work so they were still viable. They hadn't been shot down completely. My guess is, had we been able to see it all through before the Wall Street Journal cottoned on to what we were doing and took us public ahead of schedule, I think we probably would have got around dozen papers in. And
so how did the Wall Street Journal figure it out?
So one of the issues is, of course, when you're doing a secret project that involves things getting eventually published in the public, is that you can't hide the thing that's going public. And so there's a Twitter account called Real Peer Review that a lot of people follow that shows kind of some of the crazier papers or that come out of various sectors of academia in real peer-reviewed journals. Sometimes they do people's thesis or dissertation also, but something that's been vetted academically at the highest levels. That just is preposterous. And so they, as we expected would happen, the moment our paper about, I'm not joking, dog humping got accepted, we realized they were going to publish it at some point, and real peer review was going to be all over that, especially since they kind of watched that particular journal. And so, kind of like clockwork, the paper came out. Luckily, there was a huge delay. The journal got bogged down for administrative reasons or whatever, and it took them 3 months or more to go from final acceptance to publication. Usually that only takes a couple of weeks online, but it took 3 months. Really good luck for us. And so it came out. Real Peer Review had a heyday with it. And so a lot of these kind of like little campus watchdog journalist outlets picked up on it, and they started looking into it. And one thing that always comes up is, who wrote this? Let's verify that it's really academia. And we made the mistake, because we wrote that paper really early on and didn't know what we were working with yet. We made the mistake of saying that the author was a PhD in feminist studies, as opposed to, say, gender studies or something that's more common. And there are only 4, I believe, is what they told me, degree granting institutions that give PhDs in feminist studies. So one of the journalists just called all of them and said that there was no record of such a person. And
so journalism lives, apparently.
Not to be rude to anybody, but yes, even at the lowest levels it lives. And so they ended up contacting the journal that published our paper and asking questions, which got the journal suspicious. But as journalism lives, as journalism does, when a small journalist is trying to drum up support for, in this case, her story, she contacts bigger journalists to try to, get a little brouhaha going around it. Right. So she contacted another journalist at the Wall Street Journal who she knows, and told her enough to get her curious. And so then when the Wall Street Journal started asking questions, both of us and of the journal, everything got serious fast. And so we realized the wheels are shot off the bus. We're sliding to where we're going to slide, and it's time to go public. We can't keep the ruse going. Like, if we wanted to keep the ruse going with the journal at that point, it would have required forgery, and we weren't about to do that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't ever supposed to be like that level of deception. Yeah. And to keep the ruse going against, to hope the Wall Street Journal could run a story and it wouldn't just keep snowballing, is just naive. So we decided to call the Wall Street Journal and tell them what was going on and begin the process of turning that into a story, which eventually came out. It took a couple of months for them to be able to pour through, almost 400,000 words of documents and data that we had.
Wow.
And finally take it public. So that's the story of what happened and why we ended up going public without having finished our inquiry, maybe 6 months ahead of schedule.
Okay. How did the 3 of you find each other? Because you're all in different places, and there's not, if you were all, let's say, on one campus, that would make sense. But
right.
How did the 3 of you know each other and find each other, and then at some point say, we're going to cook up a conspiracy?
Twitter.
Okay.
So, a long time ago, I don't know if your listeners would know, but you certainly would know that I was active. Actually, all 3 of us were active in various ways in the so-called atheist movement.
Okay.
And we're all, so there's the common thread.
Interesting.
And so a long time ago, Sam Harris had gotten attacked for something, and I wrote a defense of him, and Peter Boghossian noticed it and asked me if I wanted to write with him. So we started a writing collaboration, maybe 2013 at that point, before his book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, came out.
Yep.
And so then, I don't know exactly the timing on this, but it was similar timing that I was actually talking to Helen on Twitter, and she and I were arguing pretty intensely. She finally agreed with me, which is the most important point, of course. But we had a pretty serious, not like hostile, but, substantive philosophical disagreement about some point or another. And so we ended up taking it out of public Twitter and discussing it in private.
Okay.
And started to understand each other better and became kind of friends. I do remember at that point when I was arguing with her, though, sending Peter a message and saying something about, I can't get rid of this insufferable Helen Pluckrose. And so, that's how we started. So we formed kind of a V with me at the middle. Helen and Peter didn't work directly together, but I worked with both of them, and I wrote essays with Helen and we mostly tried to write op-eds, and maybe even Peter and I collaborated recently on a book that's just on its way to press now.
Okay.
So it should come out this fall about how to have conversations with people you don't agree with.
Okay. So that's what you were working on. That's not, I mean, I know Peter has his manual for creating atheists, and I just bought your book yesterday, so I haven't had a chance to look at it yet.
Sure.
But you were looking at, so you're part of the atheist movement, but you're also looking at having good conversations.
Sure, exactly, all along. And as far as being part of the atheist movement goes, getting interested in the social justice stuff, I feel like the atheist movement served as kind of a social test bed because it was bent very liberal or very left, really, and progressive.
Yeah.
It also, being that it was kind of standing up to or trying to fight against, or however you want to phrase it, religion, it has that sort of postmodern deconstruction built right into it.
Yeah.
And I always felt like there were two atheist movements kind of running in parallel. You had the rationalists, Sam Harris, for example, being kind of its avatar. And then you had the social justice people who were mad at the church for having the wrong attitude about gays and women. And I always felt like they were running in parallel. And I feel like the social justice crowd ultimately ate the atheist movement from within and more or less undermined it and destroyed it. And did so trying to, achieve their moral mission, but also, for their own fun and profit. Yeah. And so, like, they wanted the speaking gigs, they wanted the recognition, etc. And so the book that I wrote, which was called Everybody's Wrong About God, I wrote that in 2014 and 15, and it came out December 2015.
Okay.
Was really, the inspiration was, I was trying to answer my question, what do people mean when they say God, when they believe? And, from a position that assumes none of the religious architecture, no theology. What does this word mean from a purely materialist standpoint? Okay. And then I was trying to answer that question, and I was also trying to figure out how the atheist movement had become. I thought the religious people saying it was like its own little religion were right. I was like, how did this happen? How did something that's by definition supposed to be non-religious become blatantly religious? And I started looking into, how organizations form and groups take on ideologies and so on. And then I got really invested in that. And Peter called me one day on the phone and he says, I'm going crazy. I think I've lost my mind. I think the canon of knowledge in gender studies and feminism, etc., I think it works like the Bible for these regressive leftists. And I think it's like revealed wisdom, and I can't convince anybody. What do you think? And I was like, well, as you know, I'm working on this book, and I think it fits. I mean, you've just like plugged a big puzzle piece in. But at the same time, we're watching Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and all these guys that were kind of like the pinnacle of our movement, if you will, just getting railroaded by these social justice people. And you're getting accused of sexism. They're being accused of misogyny. They're being accused of, hidden racist things. And with Sam working so much with Islam, openly being accused of being racist and Islamophobic and everything else. And none of it made sense. So that's what turned our attention to looking at the scholarly canon in feminism and gender studies, women's studies, race studies, and so on, and saying, something's going on there. These people don't talk like normal people anymore. They aren't using the words the same way. And it's kind of, for us, looking at it from the perspective where we'd studied religion for so long, there were deep parallels there. Religious people use certain words in ways that make sense within, like grace, makes sense within the construct of religion in a way that parallels but isn't identical to its common parlance usage.
That's right.
And so there's very specialized usages of these terms. And then there's a lot of communication breakdown that happens when people don't understand that there's that broken link. Like, you say X and I hear you say it and I know what that word means, but you meant something a little different than what I'm hearing. So I come back and I say this, and we just start cross talking instead of direct talking. And so we saw this was happening, but it was being very successfully used to railroad kind, thoughtful people. Whatever you think of their metaphysics or their ideas about the universe, these are certainly not bigots. These are certainly not people trying to cause harm and damage. And they're just, and railroading is the only way to describe it. Getting pushed off of stages, having conferences shut down. I mean, Richard Dawkins got accused of some kind of sexist thing for tweeting some video, and the uproar was they canceled his attendance to some conference, and the uproar got so vicious, the stress caused him to have a stroke, and he almost died. I mean, this is like serious wow. Like levels of accusation and bullying. So we're like, okay, what do we do? Well, we were looking at new peer review, or real peer review, I should say. And then we were looking at the Feminist Glacier paper that came out in early 2016 and made headlines that people just couldn't believe it. And Peter suggested to me one day, is like, they're ready for a Alan Sokol style hoaxing. Let's do it. And so we started trying, and it didn't work real well. And so we very quickly decided we needed to understand the theory to do it better. So we called in Helen, who has, her background is in studying literature in the late medieval and early modern period. And she actually was studying how women in those periods used religious narratives to fight for their own autonomy. And if you're going to talk about women and you're going to work in the humanities, guess what they're going to make you do? And so she had to learn a ton of this postmodern theory, and she had to learn a ton of this feminist theory. So that she became kind of our oracle, or our Rosetta Stone. And so that's how we all kind of glommed together. And early on, we also, just not to leave him out, Mike Nana, like I mentioned, is doing a documentary about us, and he's tracking stuff on his YouTube channel, which is YouTube/Mike Nana, Nayna. And he, pretty early on, through a kind of weird friend of a friend, and we kind of bumbled into the idea of maybe we could have a documentary about this. And we end up talking to this guy. Turns out he's looking at, he was working pretty on the left. He was interested, what's going on. I go to these protests as a journalist with a camera. He was the camera guy. He goes to these protests, and they used to be like policy protests or event protests. And now it's like they're protesting patriarchy. They're protesting the existence of conservatives. They're protesting like ambiguous big ideas. And he said, these things are prayer rallies, but not in the form you'd usually see them. They're not protests, they're rallies. And they have there's chanting, there's, this whole set of things you're supposed to say and how to say it. He's like, this has a very prayer vibe to it. So he was looking at campus. A mutual friend of ours said, to him, you're looking at campus and wanting to figure out what's going on. Well, I know these guys that write about it, and they're doing, I'm not supposed to tell anybody, but they're doing a thing you might want to document. So we end up getting in touch with him. And then he starts telling us like all of his observations and working all that in. So that's sort of how the four of us really, Helen, Peter, and I were the ones who wrote papers, but Mike was integrally involved all along. That's how we kind of ended up, becoming this ragtag motley crew, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, something that I don't know how, it's very bizarre. And we hatched a little conspiracy. Yeah.
That's fascinating. When you talked about, I hadn't, I'm a pastor. I've never spent a lot of time. So there's this, in the church, there's kind of this tiny little group over there that does apologetics and really gets into debating atheists. I mean, I'm a pastor. You always kind of know what's going on, but you don't spend a lot of time in it. And it was in the mid, it was 2014, 2015. I'm looking around, and I was from kind of the left side of the Christian Reformed Church, which is a conservative Dutch Reformed denomination. And and I grew up, my father was a pastor in what's probably best described as a racial reconciliation church. I grew up in the 60s and 70s in Paterson, New Jersey. Martin Luther King Jr. was my hero. Roots was the show that, that was actually, last night I was watching the CNN documentary on the 70s about television in the 70s. And I was looking at they had clips from Archie Bunker, and they had clips from the Jefferson. This was what I grew up in. Yeah. And then we got into 2014, and I began listening to some of these things, and I'm thinking, there's a divergence happening here. Within the church, we're used to, a lot of people don't recognize it, but churches are used to managing change because theological conversations are essentially trying to figure out how can you change your system without breaking canon, because technology changes, new things come, and so you have to figure out, okay, how can we manage change? And so the Christian Reformed Church at the end of the 20th century fought a long, bloody war about whether or not women should be allowed into church offices. And then, about this time, it's on the horizon that, the LGBT issues were coming on the horizon. White privilege begins to get bandied about, and white privilege turns into white supremacy. And I remember in the 80s, one of my seminary professors saying, if you start calling everyone a Nazi, pretty soon you don't have that word to distinguish real Nazis from, other kinds of folks. And so his admonition at that point was, care for the language, because it's an important tool that you can use for nuance and distinguishing subtleties that are really very important, even if in the heat of a political moment, everything gets trampled. And I had no idea of these kind of two streams within atheism. And when you said, eating it from within, this has been in some ways happening in Christian denominations all across the board. And often to the death of the church, because denominations, when a church basically becomes, for a long time in a lot of places, mostly where you live. I've never lived in the Southeast. I grew up in the New York area. Now I'm living on, the left coast. So I've always lived in blue states, and I've always been comfortable in them because I've always voted Democratic, and I'm going to get lots of comments on that now that I said that again. But that's who I was. And so then I'm watching this happening, and I'm thinking, something is new here. And the more I'd listen to them talk, owning my privilege. And again, so this is a Dutch Calvinist denomination. And I'm thinking, this isn't a lot different from being a Calvinist and embracing total depravity. But as a pastor, I noticed, it's a funny dynamic that happens mentally. Once you say, well, I'm totally depraved, just kind of verbally owning it gives you a pass on actually figuring out what that means in the details of your life, because it's kind of like, well, I'm going to own my privilege, therefore anything else I say certainly must be true and right and above criticism. And so I'm watching these dynamics and I'm thinking, I know this stuff. This is religion. I'm a third generation minister, so we've always worked religious conversations, and I'm listening to this thing develop, and I'm thinking, this is really interesting. And then when your hoax papers came out, I thought, I'm not surprised at all by this. And then I watched you and your partners, all four of you, did this forum. I think it was probably at Peter's school. Yeah, and it was a fairly long video. And I watched that whole thing a few times because I was actually going to make a video on it, but then my sister died and so that whole thing got derailed. And I heard you talk about, this is kind of like Calvinism. And I thought, yeah, it is. Take it from a Calvinist.
So glad you brought up the total depravity. I mean, it's very, very uncanny how similar it is to that, to the idea that, so the idea is actually that, and I don't want to mislead anybody like I'm this expert in Calvinist theology, because I'm certainly not, but the idea that, if I understand total depravity correctly, it's that we can't be called to God because we are inherently invested in our own sin. And so you have the same idea that you can't, the way that the privilege narrative operates in this stuff that we've kind of called either grievance studies or applied postmodernism is that privilege is always, whether explicitly or subconsciously, trying to legitimize and maintain itself. It is trying to reestablish itself and maintain its dominance. So if you can take on the bite that within this kind of new faith that seems to be growing, that privilege is, a type of congenital or original sin, that dominant or powerful individuals are stuck with, then the total depravity metaphor, given that the assumption about power in postmodernism is that power always works to maintain itself. And so you can see the same thing. It's, getting rid of your, absolving yourself of your privilege would be the ideal goal. And you can't, because you're invested in it from a fundamental level that's just impossible to overcome. And so what is there to do? Hair shirts and ashes. And, it's not pretty. It's not pretty. I had a really interesting conversation with a pastor of a not Calvinist church not that long ago. And he actually, and I'll even use his phrasing. He said that his feeling is that this kind of intersectional, he doesn't really know what's going on closely with the social justice stuff. But he said, he's actually positioned somewhat to the left of his own church, and he's quite progressive and everything as well. And his feeling is that the social justice thing, whatever's going on, he called it satanic. And I said, okay, elaborate on that, because I've got my ideas of what he means when he says satanic. And he says, well, what you have is they're pursuing justice without mercy. Justice must come with mercy. And they're pursuing knowledge in a way that enables and encourages, as our papers showed, self-deception. And so if Satan is the great deceiver, they have self-deception and an utter lack of mercy at the heart of their program. And so it's not coming from a place of love, and it's not coming from a place where justice is tempered by mercy and balanced by it. So it's not just justice in the sense of being, the kind of justice that would be just. And so he said that that's the mark from his theology of something being satanic, whatever you want to take satanic to mean. Yeah. And so we had a really fascinating conversation about that. And I don't know if it's that this is just a severe view, or if that there's no avenue, because, within theology, you have grace. So you have this, supremely powerful thing, if you will, a force that can come in and counteract something. I know in the Calvinist theology it doesn't work that way, but they can counteract something that's even depravity, where you are invested in your own sin. And if you don't go to total depravity, it works out okay. Grace can serve as the thing that intervenes upon that and can remind you of mercy and love and the other components. But when you try to come at this purely from a material perspective, and you see privilege, and you see injustice, social injustice, and you see structural inequality, what is there? If you don't believe that there's something like grace that can come in and intercede and say, okay, this person has shown contrition, this person really is, woke or an ally or whatever the phrasing is. So, we don't have to bandy on about his privilege any longer. If you don't have that, what have you got? And so this guy was saying that, it's deception. You have somebody would Satan. So you have this idea that you can confuse yourself with the false path to knowledge that's not motivated through love. It comes from this position of claiming to want to help people, but it's not willing to be humble, and it doesn't integrate mercy, love, and these kinds of things. I found this to be a profound conversation, and I'm glad I wrote my book, because I don't have to argue with his mythology or whatever I want to call it about satanic or whatever. It's like I can immediately appreciate what he's trying to say, and I think he taps into something. And I don't know if humans are humans, right? So I don't know if this social justice thing, if allowed to run longer, would start to develop a pathway to grace or salvation of some kind, probably not metaphysical, but at least worldly, acceptance. But so far it's pretty grim, and it looks like the result is that it destroys itself from within, because everybody becomes problematic eventually.
Yeah. There was I'll share the screen. David Brooks brought this piece up in one of his articles. By Wilfred Maclay, The Strange Persistence of Guilt in the Hedgehog Review. I'll put it in the notes of this show. You might want to take a look at it.
Yeah.
it's because it gets into this, because the difficulty that you have is that, okay, I'm going to nuance, so I'm a theologian, so we play with this stuff. I'm going to nuance your idea about total depravity a little bit.
Yeah, please.
There's two aspects of total depravity. One is total, not in the senses that I'm as bad as I could be, but more that every area of my life is tainted with sin. Now, of course, when you do theological conversations, you always recognize I'm speaking from the Dutch Calvinist tradition, which is different from the English Calvinist tradition. This gets hopelessly complex as you move through time. So total depravity means that I'm not as bad as I could be, but every area of my life is tainted by sin and limitation. Yeah. And so that's one aspect. The other aspect is that we are, and this comes out of Augustine, we are dead in our sins. And so we, in fact, need regeneration. We need a power from outside of us to come in. Now here's this little trick that happens, and which I noticed because I heard white privilege, and I grew up. So again, we were in Paterson, New Jersey, and we had some Dutch Calvinists who were part of our tradition, our church, but most of the folks were black folks. And you grow up in a situation like that. I mean, it's patently obvious that yes, the playing field is terribly uneven. It's terribly uneven by virtue of history. And again, I'm growing up in the 60s and 70s outside of New York. Folks who are worshiping in the black ghetto want to visit some of their friends who drive into the black ghetto every Sunday for church, but they drive out to go to their house and they get pulled over by the cops in a place like North Haledon, New Jersey, which is a mile and a half from where they're living, because New Jersey's this patchwork of little ghettos when I was growing up. And so that, no, there is a thing called white privilege. However, and this is where it gets to be like total depravity. Just because I can recognize that there are advantages that I have by virtue of the color of my skin in certain contextual situations doesn't mean that this affords me secret knowledge.
Yes.
And that's kind of the trick. And so what happens, and so I grew up in Paterson, and I lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan, kind of the hub of our denomination. And then I was a missionary overseas. Now suddenly tables are reversed, and I see what racism looks like in the Dominican Republic, Dominicans and Haitians and Americans. And so I was very used to looking at racism. You go into another context and you begin to realize racism is a given, but the manifestations of racism are particular to every different context, okay? So then I'm listening to people say things like, well, you can't speak because you're white, but they're talking to me and they're white. And I'm thinking, now how exactly does this work? Because if you actually believed you couldn't have knowledge because you're white, then you would shut up. Oh, but I'm allying. Okay, so and so you begin to track this thing down. Well, what about the black conservatives? Well, they've just, I forget the language that they have. You know it better than I do. They basically absorbed the white supremacy, and they are now vocalizing it. And it's like, no, wait a minute. We're not really, pretty quickly when you start playing this race game, you realize that it becomes, in religious terms, a confessional game. And so we really are back really to thought tribes and not honestly racial tribes. But one of the things that McClay brought up in his piece here, which David Brooks had brought up in the piece that referenced it in the Times, was that at some point within this new religion, I have a variety of names for this religion. One of my names is progressive liberationism, because the goal is liberation, and it's a progressivistic religion. So in this progressive liberationism, there is no redemption. That there is no way to finally to have your sin, your original sin. See, in Christianity, you have powerful strikes against you, especially in Calvinism. There's total depravity. There's original sin. There's even, in some tribes, original guilt, which is a little bit different from original sin. And these are big deals and big strikes against you. Yeah. But there is the God of creation is also the God of redemption. And so within this narrative, though you are born white, there is salvation. And what McClay goes into is that, well, let's imagine that you're a person born of white privilege here in the white supremacist United States, and you've made use of all of the benefits of modernity that are destroying the world through CO2 and all of your avaricious consumption. The point that this guy makes is, how will you atone for this? The only, in a sense, the only way to, if you really want to stop your carbon footprint, I guess it's suicide. There's really no way to get out of this. Plus, and this is one of the things that I've been dealing with as I've been working through all the Jordan Peterson stuff, there's a utopianism that comes into this.
Yep.
But as you noted, no one is pure enough for this utopianism. And the more I look at, so I also have my degree in history, and you look at some, let's say, the utopian movements of the 19th century, they're fascinating because there's some similarities here. To one degree or another, and this is, of course, one of the things that Jordan Peterson brings in the 20th century with both Nazism and then communism. In a sense, if you want to bring heaven on earth, you must also bring hell on earth. Because, and this is what, let's say, happened. Timothy Snyder wrote a terrific book that you don't want to read if you're given to depression, called Bloodlands, about basically the land between Hitler and Stalin in the 30s and 40s. I mean, first Stalin comes, and then Hitler comes, and then Stalin comes back. I mean, these poor people just had, it was just a disaster. But, everyone's trying to build a utopia. Well, how are you going to build a utopia when people are beyond redemption? There's no purity sufficient to warrant their continued existence. It's going to get ugly, and at least in Jordan Peterson's words, this stuff can flip fast. And so, so then listening to you guys, because I knew Peter Boghossian and some of his work because of the book that he had written. Right. And I'm listening to you guys and I'm thinking, now this is really interesting, because here, from a religious point of view, I'm watching this and saying, this is not a good thing. And at least on the Christian side of the line, it is taking on the mantle of Christianity. It is saying, this is what true Christianity is. And I'm thinking, Christianity's been around for a long time, and I really don't think you're making your case. So then I gave it a new name because I wanted to distinguish it from Christianity. Then I watch you guys, the atheists, and I'm thinking, well, that's really interesting. and so how has this affected your life? I mean, you're not making, unlike Peter, who is now in hot water, and of course, Jordan Peterson has been in hot water, and Brett Weinstein, I just saw a video released today. I haven't seen a chance to watch it yet by Mike.
Probably made that. Yeah. Yep. I'm in it.
So he's in hot water. And so in a sense, and what was also interesting to me is that, and to a certain degree, I forget, one guy was, in a sense, of course, the universities grew out of the church in the late Middle Ages. And so there's been a deep tie. George Marsden, a historian from my tradition, has written a fair amount about, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the church and the universities kind of went like this. Yeah. But there's a churchy aspect that remains in universities. The teachers are called professors, and I sometimes remind people of that and say, did you ever ask yourself what they're supposed to be professing? Mm-hmm. Because they're basically, it's a confessional language. So now you see this happening in the university, and of course Jonathan Haidt is out there, and Jonathan Haidt's focus seems to be, we're going to lose science, and that obviously is something that Jordan Peterson was looking into. But now Peter Boghossian, I didn't know what his degree was in. He teaches philosophy, right? And now he's in trouble. He probably never had to do this style social science research paper in his life. And it's the review board that takes him up.
Yeah, it's got technicality written all over it. I mean, my feeling is, of course, these boards exist for a reason. They should probably do an investigation. And when they're going to decide things, and what they decide should be very telling, whether for good or for bad. And it should probably initiate more conversations than anything. But it does have technicality written all over it. It has this feeling like the hot water is being poured on him on purpose kind of feeling to it. So yeah, it's not a pretty sight.
So early on, you said, you talked about, to produce and legitimize knowledge. And so for me, now my tradition isn't really anti-science. I come out of Calvin College, which has always tried to hold the two books together, to
right.
deny evolution, to not go that way, to try and continue in our system to look at the two books, the book of the Bible, which is special revelation, and then general revelation. And how has this made you think about, or maybe has this made you think about the ways in which even scientific knowledge requires presuppositions?
So less than you probably think. Like I said, I spent a bit of time studying philosophy of science before I got into all of this stuff. And so I'm pretty comfortable with the idea that there are some presuppositions that underlie science that are necessary. I generally would say that, and I could deploy, complicated arguments or whatever, that they do justify science as being a worthy method of producing provisional knowledge. And that's one of the points that gets lost in all of this, is that all scientific knowledge is provisional by definition. And that's why it works, is because when we come up with better knowledge or a better idea, then it supplants the worse idea. We can update our theories. We can update our models.
Right.
But what I see here is much more troubling. What I see here is that for various reasons that I don't claim to fully understand, we have something that's distinctly not science that is getting to pass as though it is science. In Sweden, some of the stuff that we call gender studies, or much of it, gets called gender sociology. When you look at work like what Robin DiAngelo does, who's in the video you mentioned that you haven't had a chance to watch yet, that Mike just put out, Robin DiAngelo is the one responsible for the idea of white fragility. These are sociological concepts. Now, sociology, of course, is a messy, difficult science because the parameter space is gigantic, and it's very, very complicated to understand what's going on with something as complex as societies filled with individual agents, which are themselves enormously complex at the psychological level. And then you can just rattle it all the way down to atoms if you want to, and it just gets worse. So it's difficult, but there is such a thing as sociological rigor. And when you start allowing people working within the humanities to draw sociological conclusions without demanding that they apply sociological rigor, now you've got a problem. And as our papers aimed to show, certainly presuppositions are exactly what, we were putting forth presuppositions as the conclusion, and then massaging the literature that exists to conclude what we initially just wanted to say. And so that's really, I'm friends with a number of scientists. The harder the science, the less likely you are to be able to pull that off. I talked with a physicist, for example, who told me that if we tried to do something similar in their field, we would have had the reviewers come back to us and give us nearly incomprehensible things. Like, you used this statistical method, but you didn't use these other ones, and these are more robust in this situation because, and they tell you that because, and I didn't even understand what he said. And so the idea there is that there's a lot of rigor going into being able to draw those conclusions. And then when we came public and we said that sociology has a problem, which a recent paper by somebody, Horowitz, has showed that there is a problem in sociology along these lines. But we said sociology has a problem, and the sociologists went berserk. You didn't show sociology has a problem with your paper. Sociology rejected your papers. So that indicates that there is a level of rigor there that is missing from these humanities journals, which are neither doing humanities, because what they're doing is not serving the study of the humanities or even humans. It's just the promulgation of their own ideology in new and more varied and often kind of a one-upmanship paradigm kind of way. And then they're also not doing sociology because they aren't using any rigor. When we had one of our papers that the peer reviewers indicated to us that what we should do is take out the quantitative data in the statistical analysis, because it was difficult for them to comprehend the statistics, which were freshman introductory course level. Any social scientist would know those statistics. Every social scientist has to know those statistics. It wasn't complicated stuff. I don't remember statistics that well. I had to make up what I know. And so secondly, they said that they preferred the qualitative narrative side for drawing their conclusions. They preferred the special revelation of, the underprivileged voice or whatever it is who's believed to be giving the insightful knowledge, who has special access to knowledge. At that point, you're not doing humanities, you're not doing social science, you're just doing something impoverished in between. But through some process that Brett Weinstein actually called idea laundering, this goes through their peer review system and it comes out the other side, not only legitimately treated as though it's knowledge and applied in various contexts, especially in education. This stuff carries the imprimatur of being sociology. Almost everybody I've talked to, in an interview format at some point slips and calls this stuff sociology. Yeah. It's just a natural slip. Why? Because we consider it to be sociology. They're talking about sociological concepts. They're drawing conclusions. So in this case, I see presuppositions being overwhelmingly the problem, but I don't see what these people are doing as science. So these are two separate conversations, and we can have either or both at various points, but I don't see this stuff as reflective of what's going on in science at all, because this is people being allowed to pretend to do science.
Yeah. Is it in some sense the sociological version of creation science, in that, well, here's the outcome we're looking to get at, so let's fill. And I don't mean to be disparaging to the creation scientists, but
I needed that. That's exactly what it is.
I probably shouldn't give that to you, but in terms of our other fights,
we'll cite you. We'll cite you on that.
Oh no!
Or we won't if you don't want us to.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
We have this whole world now where nobody wants it. They tell us stuff and they don't want to be associated with it, just in case they get burned or something.
YouTube is a place for people with little to lose, and I'm of an age and in a place where one of the things that interests me too is that, I look at, say, Peter Boghossian, and I've been watching the videos where now suddenly he's in hot water. And of course, a couple of years ago, Jordan Peterson, was in hot water. And I'm thinking, I'm so used to this in the religious context, because again, what you tend to have then are these confessional camps. So if there's a guy in Toronto named John Sook, who was a very high status Christian Reformed pastor, who basically came to doubt and was flipping on some progressive boundary markers, and so left the Christian Reformed Church and then joined the United Church of Canada. And so at least within religion, you have a whole diversity of camps that if at some point you decide, I knew a guy who was in a conservative Presbyterian denomination where they didn't believe in miracles or signs of wonders, and he's praying one day and he finds himself speaking in tongues, and it was like, oh, I'm in trouble with my tribe. So then he had to switch to a conservative Reformed denomination that didn't have a problem with that. And so within religious communities, there's been a way of managing these things, but in a sense, within kind of the Rupert Sheldrake made a comment about, we've got a separation between church and state, but we don't have a separation between science and state. And in a sense, when science is kind of a monolithic religious structure, well, right now, science is having a civil war, and this one faction is, if you listen to Jordan Peterson or Jonathan Haidt, this one faction is threatening the temple, because it's a coup from within.
It is a coup from sort of at the bottom on one wing, and it's seeming to like knock some pretty important supports out. So yeah, it's a real issue. And you know, we talk about, I'm just stuck on that creationist thing, because we talk about like the blank slate ideology that underlies a lot of this as being kind of like the psychological version of creationism, right?
That's right.
But to think of the idea that society is organized in continually self-legitimizing and perpetuating power dynamics is sociological creationism.
That's right.
And
that's right.
that particular concept, I mean, you hooked me. I'm like, whoa, that's a big one. So I'm really, really excited about, I've not thought that before. I'm really, really excited about that. I do see though that what you have here is there's a blatant attempt, an open attempt to remake science, to insist that science is sexist, whether it's sexist in terms of how it's done, sexist in terms of what kind of conclusions it draws. I mean, you can look back to the feminists in the 90s and before saying things like Sandra Harding said that, and then it's would have been in the 80s actually. Sorry, Sandra Harding saying that Newton's Principia Mathematica is a rape manual and raping nature, feminine nature. You have Luce Irigaray saying stuff like, you know, we privilege rectilinear motion, which is masculine, and we downplay fluid dynamics, which is feminism or feminist, feminine. I'm having a hard time here. And because I'm trying to remember, she also said something about E equals MC squared being a sexed equation because it privileges the speed of light above all other speeds by giving a special status. And you see this shit and it's just unbelievable. But to this very day, you still see it. I just shared on Twitter yesterday an article talking about some kind of like diversity initiative at Fermilab. And there's this constant thing. So is it the science itself is sexist? Is it that science bakes in sexist assumptions? These are like the same kinds of, as an atheist who, you know, fought on the behalf of science against creationists in particular, living in the Southeast. It's very similar to what we saw there where, you know, oh, well, science is just, you know, exclusionary of our revelation, and it cooks the books in its own favor, and it doesn't admit certain kinds of knowledge, and all this same kind of stuff's going on here. But then you also have this idea like that science doesn't and hasn't and still can't employ enough women. Therefore, there's some idea that, you know, female science isn't being done to a sufficient level, and there's sexist exclusion and blah, blah, blah. But when you think about the principle of universality in science, whether you accept this or not, but if you just let's go into it and take it as a granted element of science, anybody who does the experiment, if it's finding out something true about the world, will get the same result.
Right.
Anybody. It could be a robot, it could be a dog, it could be you, it could be a woman, it could be anybody. Should get the same result. That's universality in science. Then it shouldn't matter if there are any women scientists. It shouldn't matter if there are any men scientists. It shouldn't matter if every scientist is a dog.
Right.
The results, you know,
right.
are so baked in is this assumption that there's some kind of inherent power dynamic by excluding too many women or making women uncomfortable, and it's somehow unfair. And you see this initiative to polarize science around matters of identity being very, very effectively put forward. And if it's happening at Fermilab, which is a physics lab, it's happening at you can't get a hard enough science to say it's not happening here. Yeah. One of our papers was about saying that we needed a feminist astronomy that was built out of queer astrology. Yeah. And so one of the peer reviewers wrote back to us that they're very sympathetic to our aims. They thought our paper needed a lot of tightening up on the research level and the writing, but they like our aims. And they said something very close to paraphrase it, we've had great inroads into the social science, soft sciences like social science and biology, and we have not made good inroads into the hard sciences. So we're looking forward to driving forward into those. Right. This is an agenda. And
it's a missionary zeal.
It is missionary zeal. It is, as you phrased it, it is an attempted coup from within. Yeah. And we saw what happened with the atheist movement. It was like a perfect test bed. Then you can look at like the documentary, the mini doc that Mike put out yesterday. You can look at what happened at Evergreen. You can see how they can take over a particular institution. I would say that they've gone a long way to taking over academic institutions overall, because they have used their missionary zeal like most people would do, right? Where are you going to reach to make effects in the world? Where you can reach. You're going to reach and grab the thing right in front of you. If you work in the university, you're going to do stuff at the university. So they're very interested in changing how we teach, very interested in the curriculum, and they're extraordinarily motivated to become administrators. Yeah. And so you have this entire administrative class that's heavily influenced by or filled with diversity officers, inclusion. I'm not saying that diversity and inclusion, et cetera, in principle are necessarily bad things here. I'm saying that you have these, as you would rightly call them, missionaries who are working to push a moral agenda through them, or ideological agenda through them, that have worked very diligently to make sure that those offices exist and push exactly what they want them to push without a whole lot of debate about it.
Yeah. I was at a community meeting the other night, and I'm in the same neighborhood as the Stefan Clark incident that happened a number of months ago. And so public radio was doing a community meeting. They wanted to get stories out of the neighborhood, blah, blah, blah. I've done a lot of work. There's a lot of group homes in this neighborhood, a lot of homelessness, a lot of people with mental illness issues. I've got a lot of that in my church. I've got a lot of experience with it. One of the individuals was saying how, we've got difficulties in the Black and Hispanic. It's also an incredibly diverse neighborhood. Black, Hispanic, Asian, just about every population is there. We've got incredible difficulty in getting these minority communities to deal with mental health stigma. And then somebody else from the community who's African American, he was saying, yeah, when it comes to like issues of mental health stigma and issues of, let's say, LGBT stuff, the Black community, the Hispanic community, the Asian communities, they're all much more resistant to these efforts. And I was listening to them and I was thinking, yeah, but Freud, Jung, Carl Rogers, isn't this entire mental health construct white supremacist? I mean, if you really want to apply that, you can't on one hand say, oh, there's the white supremacy that's taking over, and on the other hand say, yeah, but this whole idea of reducing stigma of mental illness and the Black community isn't getting with on that. So in other words, you need to be colonized by the white psychologists to this, and then it comes back around. And I also look at people sometimes and say, well, I just don't want to be downstream from the white supremacy. And I think, well, doesn't that make the Wright brothers white supremacy? Every time you get on an airplane, you are bearing the fruits of your supposed white supremacy. And so once you begin to actually start say, okay, so here's this way that you seeing the world. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try it on and try and put your glasses on my eyes and see how much white supremacy and patriarchy I can see. So therefore, if you get onto an airplane, well, it's just white supremacist patriarchy that's, sending you from coast to coast in 4 hours instead of, using your little feet to walk. So, this system just doesn't work. And, so then part of me, when I look at some of the other philosophical things, I don't know if you listened to the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversations. They were quite interesting because
they were a bit prickly.
Yeah. Well, but also, I mean, part of the thing that fascinated me about Peterson right away was the question of, okay, so we've got the hard sciences over here, but we've certainly benefited from the results of the marriage of technology and hard sciences for airplanes and sewer systems and roads and medical technology. But when you get to something like the question of mental health, boy, that's a complicated space.
It's much more complicated. Certainly.
Oh, it's so complicated. And so what is a healthy person? And so we were talking about, California laws with respect to mental illness. And California, a couple of decades ago, took a fairly libertarian approach where, you're pretty much free to be crazy here. And then that leads to, a variety, homelessness and a whole bunch of other things that we see. So you've got someone who's schizophrenic and they might say, well, what you call schizophrenia, I call liberation. It's like, okay. And how then, well, schizophrenia is obviously an edge case, but there's there's a spectrum all along the way there. And so these questions get enormously complex. And part of the difficulty is that, again, because of if I would go to the city council and say, well, I think this and this and this shouldn't be true because the Bible says so. Well, everyone in our culture would say that's illegitimate. We have a separation of religion. But one of the people in my Jordan Peterson called it woozling, how you continue to get all of these papers to agree, and one paper builds on the next, and before you know it, you bring it to the courthouse and say, well, this is science, and therefore from science, law is downstream from science in our system.
Yep. That's exactly the problem, actually, that we're seeing, really manifest at this point, is that these, I don't want to say it this way, but I'm going to, these people have been these people. But the people
Ross Perot.
the people that have been working in these disciplines, cultural studies disciplines, grievance studies, really, this has been 5-6 decades now. And what you're talking about is having built up an entire canon of literature that is very. I mean, we cited one of our own papers in a later paper. So
you're doing your own woozling in your own.
Exactly, we woozled ourselves. I think we wrote a paper about woozling ourselves too. But so we see how that works, and it's like the ability to legitimize what amounts to prejudices and opinions, or if you will, special revelation of particular individuals or specially sanctioned groups. In this case, oppressed groups become specially sanctioned to generate certain knowledge. Then if you're going to take that as though is something that it's general revelation as opposed to special revelation, then you've got a serious problem. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And it's a form of legitimizing special revelation. And because it comes from a place that appears to be secular rather than sectarian, there's absolutely no way for us to say, hey, we need to apply the principles. We're a secular state. We see the benefits of a secular state. We want to be a secular liberal state. Fine. So we can apply that. So the second you come to the courthouse and say the Bible, told me so, they're like, listen, Paul, go find another argument. I like your idea, but go find another way to justify it. And so I wrote that long essay on Aereo recently it was a postmodern religion and the faith of social justice or something was the title. And the last section of it, other than maybe a short conclusion, I don't recall, is about construing secularism more broadly. But the problem is I've left open a wide gaping loophole that these kind of, religious type architectures that are nevertheless secular, because they haven't taken on what I call in the article a pre-modern mythology, which is what we usually identify religions with. The whole, before the modern period, we saw deities, and so that's the pre-modern structure to it. Well, this postmodern mythology, God's dead. There is no God in postmodern mythology. So we don't have that ready ability to say, oh, I know what this is. This is religion, and religion has no place here. You need a better argument. And so there's this gaping hole there. I know what to do about it on the social level, right? I know exactly what to do. I want to convince as many people as I can that when they hear somebody say, hey, have you checked your privilege, or is that your privilege talking, they have that same gut reaction as when they hear a Christian rock song on that they didn't think was Christian rock, and like, wait a minute, I know what this is. I didn't want to listen to this, or whatever it happens to be, They see the street preacher proselytizing. They know what this is. I want that feeling to come along with this same, like, really rabid social justice activism. But I don't know what happens when you get to the legal level. Because if you walk into the courthouse, you are at a disadvantage, if you will, because you can't, and this is a thing that personally you're at a disadvantage because you can't use your religious argument to justify what you want. Right. So you have to find some other argument where societally we say, okay, this does generate an advantage because that way whatever groups are dominant, they don't get to just make the rules for everybody else. So here we have these so-called secular religion things that have this kind of bogus exemption to that because, and it's a technicality because they're using a different way to, they're using a fundamentally different mythological structure underneath. Instead of deities and whatever, Buddhism doesn't really have deities directly. Some Buddhism does and some doesn't. It gets icky, but we know what religions look like when we've called them religions, and we know what to do with that. But then when you have this mythology that society is made out of structural power dynamics that are always trying to justify themselves, and there's your creationist thing there, and that humans are blank slates who are entirely written upon by their socialization. There's another creation. When you have this mythology over here that plays out entirely in a material way, we don't know what to do with it. And secularism is the answer, but we don't know how to figure out how and when to apply it. So I think that's a big point and a huge thing that we're going to have to figure out how to tackle in the next maybe 20 years.
Well, and behind all of this is the question of how do we know what is good? Because again, I find not enough historians in this conversation, because part of the difficulty that people have, well, part of also what this has done is harrow history as well, because it's a real easy way to delegitimize anything that we can learn about humanity from the past.
Yes.
We can't accept that because they were slaveholders.
Yes, exactly.
Accept that because they believed in a sky daddy. So
exactly.
So again, it gets 1984-ish awfully quickly. But
it can, yeah.
But again, beneath this, and this again is where I think the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversations, if you kind of get beyond the whole tribal blood sport aspect of it, which is, in my opinion, really rather dull.
Yeah.
Because that's just two tribes disagreeing. Okay, well, tribes always disagree. And via sociology, we know that tribes have good reasons to disagree completely apart from whatever it is they're actually talking about. Those are human psychological, sociological dynamics. We know that.
Yes.
But if you get onto the question of it, you have the question of how do we know the good?
Yes.
Which is not different from how do we know what is healthy? And so in a sense, what happened in terms of our history is we began to say, okay, we're going to avoid avoid sectarian war by, in a sense, saying religions are things that trade off ancient mythologies. We're going to set all them over there. And so we're going to use science instead. And now you have the question, which is a very difficult one. Can science say what is good? Now, if we say, well, we would really like to get from New York to San Francisco in just a few hours instead of a few weeks, that's good. Well, but there are always other things that are connected to everything that's built into that. And so, which of course we found with, DDT is good. Look, there's a great YouTube where a guy sprinkles it on his porridge and eats it in front of the African natives, and they look at him and they're like, this guy don't have it all, So there are deep, deep questions beneath this conversation that have been stalking a lot of the other conversations that we've been having. And so for me, this is, again, another good time to say, all right, well, we're going to have to, and I'm really happy to hear, where we started this conversation, we're going to have important conversations between people of different tribes.
Oh, yeah. I think
those skills we need.
Yes. We're at a moment where I think what's definitely both becoming a growing interest in people, but a growing necessity is, as Mike and I talk about it a lot, we phrase it as uniting tribes. To start reaching across. We have all these bubbles, and the internet creates such an ability to do kind of like ideological feudalism. And it's very difficult to reach across these and to speak to one another. And I think that's exactly, what we need to do. I do like, for example, from Jordan Peterson's approach to things, the way that he likes to draw upon whatever his religious or metaphysical commitments may or may not be. He likes to draw upon wisdom. Right. So I used to play when I was a teenager. I don't know if I should tell you this as a pastor. I used to play Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, so did I.
Oh, no. Okay. But there's a reason that the intelligence and the wisdom categories, I thought about this way too deeply as a teenager, but there's a serious difference between intelligence and wisdom. Yes. And there's a reason why those are two different categories with two different scores, with two different sets of consequences, depending on what happens in the game when you play. So I feel like we're at this weird place And if you look at kind of what they call the intellectual dark web, for example, I feel like so much the conversation boils down to that same argument I had with myself when I was 15 about the differences between intelligence and wisdom, knowledge, and then wisdom. I don't know another word for it. I always think at this time of like Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow or Joshua Green's Moral Tribes, and you start talking about the automatic mode, which is very intuitive and it's very quick, and it's the way we have to interact with human beings because otherwise everything's too slow and clunky. And then you have the manual mode that's very, very, precise, and you get it exactly right. But it takes a long time and it doesn't serve us in 90% of our situations. And so wisdom seems to fall in mostly into that automatic mode, and then intelligence falls into that manual mode. And the slow thinking is intelligence, and then the fast thinking is wisdom. And you really do need to cultivate both and draw across from both to inform one another, and in particular to know when to use which.
Yeah.
And so I feel like we're at a crossroads right now where that conversation, if you want to like whittle it all down to its barest, like what's going on here, philosophically abstract parts, it's that. It's the intelligence versus wisdom, intuition versus methodological careful thought, etc. That's where it's kind of the conceptual battleground of the moment is. And we have a real problem still with people not doing a good job of listening to one another across those lines, or being able to articulate that discussion well. So I think that's where we're headed, is to have that conversation.
Yeah. And if you can't talk with the heretics, well, what you've taken most of the good options off the table. Well, what are you going to do with the heretics? Are you going to put them in camps? Are you going to shut up your ears? Are you going to, that's where, when we try to bring heaven down, we usually bring hell up.
Yeah.
Because now suddenly you have to purify, and kind of the way people work, finally, the only pure one is me. And that never goes well.
Yeah, funny how that one works.
Well, I'm gonna end the recording, and because I know you've got a hard quit time. I
do. Yeah, I've got 40 minutes till I've got an appointment, and when that person will show up is unclear. So
okay, but before I turn off the recording, I do want to just thank you for
thank you
to have this conversation and even talk to a religious guy.
I like religious guys. If I didn't like religious guys, I wouldn't have any friends. I live in the Southeast. What are you talking about? Now, almost all my friends, it's really funny because, I'm a liberal atheist here in the South. And so like all of my friends are not just conservatives, but mostly like super conservative. And then almost all of my friends are Christian. I just don't know that many other people. There aren't that many to know around here. And it's fine. It's like a good way to practice for both parts in the relationship. The old wisdom of Thomas Jefferson, don't let matters of religion or politics or philosophy come between friends. There are other things in life, and relationship is one of them, and communication is one of them, and sharing and wisdom is one of them. And you lose a lot, like you were just saying, if you decide to, you think differently than I do, or your metaphysical commitments are different, or your politics are different, or you think we should, I know there are a lot of emotions that run with it, but for most people on a day-to-day basis, something like the issue of immigration, which is very hot right now, plays very little role in their day-to-day lives. They don't have, I don't have to go over to my neighbor and hate him because he thinks something I think is stupid about immigration, and vice versa. So it's good to kind of recalibrate, to spend time with and converse with people that think differently than you are, not just because of finding things that, not just because of that, because of being able to find what matters, right? Which is maybe the biggest thing, that we're humans, we're together, we get a little while on this planet, whatever comes next, fine. But we get a little while here, we should probably try to optimize that with each other. Yeah. But there's also the aspect of getting new ideas. But I think it's a good high note to end on, is just sharing one another's wisdom, which is, you and I, that wisdom comes from our commonalities, but also from the unique perspective that comes with having, a lens to the world. So even this stuff like the privilege, that's a lens. The oppression, that's a lens. They say, you know, you hear listen and believe. I don't want to listen and believe, but I do want to listen and I do want to consider. You know, I want to hear if I run into, let's say it's, you know, because I'm white, so we'll just go right there. If I want to figure out what's going on in an urban neighborhood, it's filled with black people that are having a bad time, like you were describing with getting pulled over every time they leave the neighborhood. You know, how am I going to figure that out if I'm not willing to hear that out? Right. So the mistake is, you got listen and believe is still incorrect because people misinterpret their stuff all the time. But listen and consider, you know, if you're talking to me about God, I don't have any reason to think you're crazy. I have a reason to think that you're really tapping into something that I want to understand. If someone's telling me about a burning in their bosom from their Mormon perspective, I want to know what's going on, what got them there, what's happening. You know, I want to connect with that too. And if somebody's telling me that every time they drive down the street, they get pulled over 6 times because they're driving while black, you know, that's something that needs to be understood so that it can be addressed in the best ways that we have to address it. But just for them to say, you know, all this happens to me because racism, for example, maybe it does, maybe, I don't know. But it's difficult to draw that conclusions. You know, it's listen, consider, don't think the person's lying on an interpersonal level. It's not like to discount somebody's experience, but it can be seen as an information gathering and wisdom gathering and experience sharing and humanity expanding effort to listen rather than, you know, well, you don't know what it's like, so shut up.
No, I agree 100%. Well, I'm gonna pause the recording now and then just get a chance to say goodbye. And so, but again, I really appreciate it.